There's a kind of quiet you don't notice right away. It isn't dramatic, it doesn't announce itself. It just shows up slowly, usually once you've driven far enough that radio stations begin to fade and the road stops offering new decisions. That's the quiet we're talking about today. Not emotional loneliness, not sadness, just places where distance shapes daily life in ways most people don't have to think about. When people hear the phrase loneliest towns, they often imagine abandoned streets or places where nobody speaks. That's not really accurate. Most of these towns are still functioning. People wake up, go to work, buy groceries, talk to neighbors. What makes them lonely isn't what's missing inside the town, it's how far away everything else is. We're starting with places where that distance is noticeable, but not overwhelming. Towns that still feel like towns. Places you could reach without planning your life around it, but that quietly remind you you're not in the middle of anything anymore. Take Valentine, Nebraska. Valentine sits in north-central Nebraska, surrounded by open grassland that stretches in every direction without much interruption. The land here doesn't try to impress you. It's flat, wide, and patient. The horizon feels farther away than it should, and after a while you realize that nothing is blocking your view because there's nothing competing for space. With a population of roughly 2,700 people, Valentine isn't tiny by rural standards. It has grocery stores, schools, a hospital, gas stations, and the basics you'd expect from a functioning town. But the isolation doesn't come from what's missing. It comes from how long it takes to get anywhere else. The nearest major city is hours away, and the highways leading in are long, straight, and quiet. You don't accidentally pass through Valentine. You either intend to be there, or you end up there because you've been driving for a very long time. Daily life moves at a steady pace. Businesses close early. Nights get quiet quickly. There isn't much happening after dark, beyond a few lights and the sound of cars passing through on the highway. People recognize each other. Not because they're trying to build community, but because there aren't many strangers. Familiarity becomes routine. Valentine feels lonely in a manageable way. You're aware of the distance, but it doesn't interfere with daily survival. It's the kind of place where isolation exists in the background, not the foreground. You notice it most when you leave, not when you stay. That's why it belongs at the beginning of this list. Quiet, yes. Isolated, definitely. But still connected enough that the world feels nearby, even if it takes a while to reach it. Further south, the landscape changes, and so does the tone of isolation. Marfa, Texas doesn't feel like it was built for efficiency. It feels like it's settled into its current form and decided that was enough. Located deep in West Texas, surrounded by desert and open sky, Marfa is physically remote in a way that's immediately obvious once you arrive. Long drives, sparse scenery, fewer signs reminding you where you are. The population hovers around 1,800 people, but the town often feels smaller than that, not because people are hiding, but because the space around them is so large. The nearest major city is several hours away, and the drive offers very little distraction. Fences, open land, the occasional structure, that's it. Daily life in Marfa moves slowly, and not always predictably. Stores close early. Services are limited. Distances feel longer than the map suggests. When the sun goes down, the desert quiet takes over quickly. There's a stillness at night that feels heavier than silence in more developed areas. Sound doesn't bounce back at you here. It just disappears. What sets Marfa apart is that it hasn't faded into obscurity. It has an art presence, which means there are installations, galleries, and creative projects scattered across the landscape. You might drive past something large and deliberate in the middle of nowhere, with no explanation and no instructions on how long you're supposed to look at it. That combination, isolation paired with expression, gives Marfa a distinct kind of loneliness. You're far away, but not forgotten. There's activity, but it doesn't demand attention. People who stay tend to value that balance. The quiet is real, but it isn't empty. Marfa earns its place here because it introduces a different kind of distance, not just geographic, but cultural. You're removed from the pace and expectations of larger cities, even though people are still actively shaping life around them. Then there are places where the town itself feels like it's barely holding on. Terlingua, Texas sits near Big Bend National Park in one of the harshest landscapes in the state. Once a mining town, it's now closer to a near ghost town than a traditional community. The population fluctuates, but it's usually around 100 people, sometimes fewer. The environment here is unforgiving. The heat is intense, shade is limited, the land is dry and wide, and the desert stretches out in every direction. Services are minimal, cell service is unreliable, internet access can be inconsistent. Planning ahead isn't a preference, it's a necessity. If you forget something, you don't make a quick trip back to the store. You commit to a long drive through empty land, often in extreme heat, with very little along the way. That reality shapes how people live. Errands matter, supplies matter, small mistakes carry more weight. Daily life in Terlingua is quiet in a way that feels permanent. Wind carries sound across long distances. Nights are dark and still, broken only by occasional movement or distant noise. There's no background hum of traffic or city life. What you hear is what's actually there. People who stay here aren't looking for convenience, they're looking for space and independence. The loneliness is real, but it's accepted. This isn't a place you end up by accident, it's a place you choose because you understand the trade-offs. The Terlingua belongs here because it marks a shift. Isolation stops being abstract and becomes practical. The distance affects not just how you feel, but how you live. At this stage, the towns are still reachable. Roads exist, supplies come in. Help is available, even if it's far away. But the farther we go, the thinner those connections become. This early part of the list isn't about extremes. It's about noticing when the world starts to quiet down and realizing that silence doesn't arrive all at once. It builds gradually, mile by mile, town by town, until distance becomes something you plan around rather than something you ignore. By the time you reach the middle of this list, the idea of isolation changes. It's no longer just about distance on a map or long drives between towns. It starts showing up in smaller, more practical ways. In how often you see another person, in how carefully you plan your fuel stops, in how quickly the day goes quiet once the sun drops. These places still function, but they do so with fewer margins for error. Life doesn't fall apart if something goes wrong, but it becomes inconvenient fast. An inconvenience, when repeated enough, turns into a defining feature of daily living. That shift becomes clear in Eureka. Eureka sits along US Route 50, a highway often referred to as the loneliest road in America. That nickname isn't poetic exaggeration. Driving through this part of Nevada feels different from driving through open farmland or desert elsewhere. The space feels deeper, the gaps between towns stretch longer. You can travel for miles without seeing another car, another building, or even a sign that reassures you you're still on the right path. The town itself has around 500 residents. It has history, basic services, and a clear sense of place. But it's surrounded by vast desert and distant mountain ranges that make everything else feel far away. The next town isn't just down the road, it's a commitment. Daily life in Eureka is simple and repetitive by necessity. There are places to eat, places to get gas, and places to stay, but nothing excess. Entertainment isn't scheduled, it's improvised. Conversations matter more because there are fewer distractions. Weather becomes a topic not because it's dramatic, but because it affects travel, supply runs, and plans. At night, the darkness is complete. There's very little light pollution. And once businesses close, the town settles into stillness quickly. Silence here isn't rare, it's expected. And over time, that expectation reshapes how people relate to each other. Encounters are more deliberate. Familiar faces matter. Eureka feels lonely, not because no one lives there, but because there's nowhere else nearby to blend into. You are where you are, and that's it. It earns its place here because isolation isn't just felt emotionally, it's built into the geography. Moving east and south, the landscape grows more dramatic and the sense of vulnerability increases. Hanksville doesn't feel like a town so much as a pause between massive stretches of wilderness. With a population of roughly 200 people, it sits surrounded by red rock formations, desert plains and canyons that make the town itself feel small by comparison. There's essentially one main road through Hanksville. Gas stations are limited, stores are minimal. If you miss a supply run or underestimate your needs, you don't have many backup options. Help exists, but it's far away. That reality shapes behavior quickly. People who live here don't forget small things. They plan, they prepare. Running out of fuel, food, or basic supplies isn't a minor inconvenience. It can become a real problem. Over time, that necessity for foresight becomes routine. Daily life revolves around what's immediately practical. There's no rush hour, no traffic noise, no crowd pressure. The silence is steady and constant. At night, the sky takes over completely. Stars are bright, not because they're trying to impress you, but because there's nothing else competing for attention. Hanksville's loneliness comes from exposure. You're surrounded by land that doesn't soften itself for human comfort. The landscape is beautiful, but it doesn't adapt. People who stay here usually do so intentionally. They want space, they want quiet, and they accept the demands that come with both. This town sits right at the edge of where isolation starts to require discipline. You can still live a modern life here, but only if you respect the limits of the place. Then there's a different kind of loneliness entirely, one that exists even when there are people around. Garden City stands out on this list because, at first glance, it doesn't seem like it belongs. With a population of around 25,000 people, it's the largest place we've mentioned so far. It has hospitals, schools, shopping centers, restaurants, and neighborhoods that look familiar to anyone who's lived in the Midwest. But Garden City is geographically isolated in a way that's difficult to understand until you experience it. Statistically, it sits farther from other cities of similar size than almost anywhere else in the country. Once you leave the city limits, the landscape opens immediately into flat farmland that stretches on for miles without interruption. There's nothing dramatic about the terrain, no mountains, no forests, just distance, long straight roads, grain silos in the distance, irrigation systems cutting across the land. The feeling isn't emptiness, it's separation. Daily life in Garden City is busy enough. People work, socialize, raise families, and go about their routines. But travel is different here. Visiting another city means hours on the road. Opportunities exist, but they're not close. Over time, that distance becomes psychological. Garden City's loneliness isn't about silence. It's about containment. You're not isolated from people. You're isolated from variety, from spontaneity, from the sense that something else is nearby if you want it. People stay because the city is stable, affordable, and functional. It offers enough to live a complete life, but the space around it reinforces a subtle awareness. You're far from the center of things, wherever that center might be. That's why Garden City belongs in the middle of this list. It proves that loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes it comes from being surrounded by the same boundaries every day. At this point, isolation has taken on multiple forms. In some places it's environmental, in others it's logistical, in others it's psychological. What they all share is a growing sense that leaving requires intention. The towns ahead push that idea even further. Distance becomes less forgiving, access becomes conditional, and the outside world starts to feel less like a nearby option and more like a separate system altogether. For now, these places sit in a kind of middle ground. They're quiet but livable, demanding but not extreme. They don't isolate you completely, they just make you aware of how connected most places usually are. That awareness tends to linger, even after you leave. At this point, isolation stops feeling like a condition you notice and starts feeling like a rule you live under. The towns here aren't just far away, they are structurally separated from everything around them. Distance isn't an inconvenience anymore, it's a boundary. And once boundaries harden, daily life begins to organize itself differently. These are places where access is limited, not by choice alone, but by design, where leaving requires timing, permission, or endurance, where the outside world doesn't drift in casually. It arrives on a schedule, if it arrives at all. One of the clearest examples of this shift is Whittier. Whittier doesn't look real the first time you see it. Almost the entire population, around 250 people, lives inside a single massive concrete building known as Begich Towers. From the outside, it resembles an abandoned military structure more than a residential complex. From the inside, it functions as something closer to a self-contained village. Apartments, a school, offices, a small store, most daily needs are handled under one roof. Not because that's convenient, but because the environment outside doesn't always cooperate. The weather is cold, wet, and unpredictable. Winds come off the water with force. Snow and rain dominate much of the year. Getting to Whittier requires passing through a long tunnel carved into the mountain. That tunnel closes at night. When it does, the town is physically cut off. No one drives in, no one drives out. Isolation here isn't gradual or implied, it's scheduled. Daily life adapts to this reality. People plan their movements around tunnel hours. Errands have deadlines. Miss the last opening, and you wait. There's no alternative route, no workaround. The mountain decides. Loneliness in Whittier is complicated. You are rarely alone physically. Everyone lives close together. Privacy exists, but distance doesn't. You see the same faces regularly. You share space, weather, and limitations. Community is unavoidable, but geographically, Whittier is extremely alone. It sits on the edge of Prince William Sound, surrounded by water and mountains that don't offer easy exits. When the tunnel closes and the weather settles in, the town feels suspended, not abandoned, just paused. People who stay here tend to value predictability and shared experience. Life is simpler in some ways, smaller, more contained, but that containment comes with trade-offs. The outside world feels distant, not because it's far on a map, but because access is conditional. Whittier belongs here because it redefines loneliness. It shows that isolation isn't always about being alone. Sometimes it's about being enclosed. Further north and deeper into the state, the scale shifts again. Chicken is so small that calling it a town feels generous. The population hovers around a couple dozen people, sometimes fewer. There are no neighborhoods, no streets lined with houses. Just a handful of buildings scattered across rugged land. Chicken is remote, even by Alaskan standards. Winters are long, dark, and severe. Temperatures drop far below freezing. Roads can become unreliable or impassable. Weather doesn't just influence daily life, it controls it. Leaving Chicken in winter requires planning, equipment, and experience. Vehicles must be prepared, supplies must be stocked well in advance. Mistakes aren't small here. Running out of something essential can quickly become dangerous. Daily life revolves around routine and survival. People wake up, tend to what needs tending, and stay aware of conditions. There's no casual movement, no wandering. Every action has purpose. Silence in Chicken is constant, not peaceful, not dramatic, just there. Wind moves across open land. Wildlife passes through. Human sounds are rare enough that you notice them immediately. People who live here aren't looking for novelty. They're not chasing quiet as an aesthetic. They accept this environment because it aligns with how they want to live. Self-reliant, minimal, and separate from modern systems. Chicken's loneliness isn't softened or explained away. It's direct. The population is small. The climate is harsh. The distance is real. That combination places it firmly among the most isolated communities in the country. And yet, even here, there is still a town name, a post office, a sense, however thin, of continuity. The next place pushes that even further. Lost Springs is often described as the smallest incorporated town in the United States. Depending on the year, its population fluctuates between 1 and 4 people. Not households, people. Lost Springs sits on the open plains of Wyoming, far from major highways and even farther from cities. There are no clusters of homes, no visible town center. Just a few structures surrounded by land that doesn't offer much interruption. Daily life here is defined almost entirely by absence. No traffic noise, no background hum, no accidental encounters. If you want to speak to another person, you have to plan it. Conversation doesn't happen by chance. The isolation in Lost Springs is not dramatic. There are no mountains hemming you in, no extreme weather that dominates headlines. It's quiet in a flatter, more persistent way. The wind moves through open land, the sky stretches wide. Time feels slower, not because anything is wrong, but because nothing interrupts it. People who live here do so deliberately. This isn't a place you drift into. There are no jobs pulling people in, no amenities to justify staying. What remains is choice. Loneliness here is pure, in a way that's difficult to explain. There are no buffers, no distractions, no layers between you and the reality of being alone most of the time. That level of solitude isn't accidental, it's intentional. Lost Springs earns its place near the top of this list because it removes nearly every social structure people rely on without noticing. No crowd, no community, no system to lean on, just space, routine, and self-sufficiency. By now, the pattern is clear. As isolation increases, daily life narrows. Planning replaces spontaneity. Familiarity replaces variety. Silence replaces noise, not as a luxury, but as a constant. The places ahead take one final step away from modern connection. Roads disappear, access becomes physical effort, and the idea of convenience stops applying altogether. Before going there, it's worth acknowledging something important. None of these towns are broken. They aren't failures of development. They exist exactly as they are because people continue to choose them. Loneliness at this level isn't about neglect. It's about acceptance. At the far end of isolation, distance stops being something you measure in miles or hours. It becomes something physical, something you feel in your legs, in your planning, in the way you think about leaving before you ever actually do. The final place on this list doesn't just sit far from everything else. It exists outside the systems most towns rely on to function. There are no highways leading in, no parking lots, no casual drop-ins. Access itself is a decision. That place is Supai. Supai sits at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, surrounded by steep canyon walls that don't just separate it from the outside world, they define it. There are no roads connecting Supai to the rest of Arizona. No cars drive through. No traffic noise ever reaches it. The only ways in or out are by foot, by mule, or by helicopter. That fact alone reshapes everything. Distance here isn't abstract. It's counted in effort, in elevation change, in weather conditions, in how much you can carry and how carefully you pack. Supplies don't arrive on a whim. Mail doesn't show up because a truck passed through. Groceries don't restock overnight. Everything that enters or leaves Supai does so deliberately. Daily life reflects that reality. Planning is constant. Forgetting something isn't a minor annoyance. It can mean days of waiting or hours of walking. Emergency access depends on conditions beyond anyone's control. Weather matters, timing matters, physical ability matters. And yet, Supai is not empty. It is home to the Havasupai people, whose connection to this place stretches back generations. This isn't isolation born from abandonment or decline. It's continuity. Life here didn't retreat from modern systems so much as it never fully absorbed them. Children go to school, families gather, traditions continue, but the rhythm is different. Slower, yes, but also heavier. Every action carries more weight because it requires more effort. Leaving town is never casual. Returning is never automatic. Loneliness in Supai isn't about being alone. It's about separation, about knowing that the outside world exists far above you, layered with convenience and speed, while life here moves according to the land. The canyon walls aren't symbolic, they are practical limits. What's striking is how normal this becomes for the people who live here. What feels extreme to outsiders becomes routine through repetition, carrying supplies, coordinating transport, accepting delays, adapting plans. Over time, the absence of roads stops feeling like a loss and starts feeling like structure. Supai earns its place at the top of this list, not because it's the quietest or the smallest, but because it is the most disconnected from the systems that define modern American life. There are no shortcuts, no alternate routes, no way to make distance disappear, and yet life continues. This is where the idea of loneliness reaches its limit. Not because it becomes unbearable, but because it transforms. Isolation here isn't something you endure. It's something you organize your entire existence around. It becomes part of identity rather than an obstacle to overcome. Looking back across all the places we've talked about, a pattern emerges. Not a clean one, but a consistent one. As isolation increases, convenience fades, variety shrinks, access narrows, but clarity often grows. Decisions matter more. Habits stabilize. Life becomes less flexible, but also less scattered. That doesn't mean these places are better. It doesn't mean they hold answers. And it doesn't mean loneliness is something to chase or romanticize. It simply means that distance, when taken far enough, changes how life is structured. Some people find relief in that structure, others find it confining. Most people never test where their own threshold is. What these towns reveal isn't a ranking of hardship. It's a spectrum of separation, from places where isolation sits quietly in the background to places where it shapes every choice you make before the day even begins. And maybe that's the real reason places like this stay with us. Not because we want to live there necessarily, but because they force a question we don't often slow down enough to ask. How much connection do you actually need? How much distance can you tolerate? And at what point does quiet stop being peaceful and start asking something back from you? There's no correct answer. The people who live in these towns didn't all arrive at the same conclusion. Some chose solitude, some inherited it, some adapted, some left. What matters is that these places are still alive, still functioning, still inhabited by people who wake up every day and choose in one way or another to remain. That choice looks different depending on where you stand, and that's where this list ends. Not with a conclusion, but with a recognition. That loneliness isn't a single condition, and isolation isn't always a problem to solve. Sometimes it's a boundary, sometimes it's a shelter, sometimes it's simply the cost of living life at a scale that makes sense to the people who choose it. Before you go, I'm curious about something, and there's no right answer to it. Which of these places felt livable to you even for a moment? Not the most extreme, not the most dramatic, just the one where you thought, I could figure this out, or maybe none of them did. Maybe the distance felt heavy instead of freeing. If you're comfortable sharing, leave a comment with the town that stayed with you and why. Sometimes the reason matters more than the choice itself. And if this kind of quiet exploration resonates with you, consider liking the video and subscribe. We spend a lot of time online talking about what's loud and crowded. This channel is about the places and ideas that sit a little farther away. Thanks for staying with me through the silence.